On the morning of August the 15th, 1976, SAETA Airlines Flight 232 took off from the Ecuadorian capital Quito, bound for the city of Cuenca, some 360 kilometers to the south. It was a routine flight like any other, a short, hop domestic flight that took less than 2 hours. But that short 2 hours would turn into a very long time. In fact, nobody would officially lay eyes on Flight 232 for the next 26 years. Flight 232 was a short-haul domestic service operated by SAETA Air Ecuador using an old-fashioned propeller plane, a Vickers Viscount 785D. Planes like these were common in South America at the time. They were first introduced in the mid-1950s in Europe and the United States, and they were dependable, solid workhorses, with economical running and repair costs, and they were also popular with passengers due to the spacious cabin and the large oval windows. Viscounts were a popular option for smaller airlines to pick up second-hand if they wanted to increase the size of their fleet. For example, the one in today's story originally belonged to Alitalia before being sold to Air Ecuador. On board the plane that morning were 55 passengers and 4 crew. With all pre-flight checks complete, the Viscount took off from Quito's Mariscal Sucre airport at 8:06 a.m. All appeared normal. At 8:27, the pilot radioed in his position, reporting that the plane was flying at around 18,000 feet and was just passing over the town of Ambato. This communication was the last one ever heard from the plane. It never arrived in Cuenca. As it became clear that something had happened to Flight 232, the Ecuadorian authorities mounted an intense search, fanning out from Ambato and initially concentrating on the terrain of the Chimborazo mountain range. Finding nothing, the search was expanded to include more mountainous areas to the interior, and searches were even carried out as far afield as the tropical coastline. But it was all in vain. No trace of Flight 232 could be found. It was like it had just vanished into thin air. As the weeks passed with no sign of wreckage or survivors, the relatives of the missing passengers were desperate for an answer that could explain the complete disappearance of the aircraft. And in the absence of any hard evidence, supernatural causes were also contemplated. Some thought the plane had been sucked into some kind of vortex like the Bermuda Triangle, or others thought maybe it had been abducted by an alien spacecraft. As a last resort, some relatives turned to psychics to provide an explanation. But it was no use. Flight 232 had simply disappeared, and nobody had any idea at all about what had happened to it. Almost 3 years later, in April 1979, another Vickers Viscount owned by Air Ecuador, Flight 011, with 57 people on board, took off again from Mariscal Sucre Airport, again bound for Cuenca, and once again disappeared without a trace. It was uncanny. Despite extensive searching, no trace of this aircraft was found. By now, people were starting to suspect that the planes had possibly been hijacked and then flown under the radar to Colombia, where they could be used by the drugs cartels. However, in 1984, 5 years after disappearing, the wreckage of the second Vickers, Flight 011, was found scattered on a heavily forested mountain slope. All aboard had perished on impact. The plane was 49 kilometers off course. There was no obvious explanation as to what had happened. The cause of the crash remained a mystery, although, at least for the relatives of the dead, well, they had an answer as to what had happened to their loved ones. They weren't just left in limbo. Now, for the relatives of the missing Flight 232, there was no such closure. The years went by with no new leads and no new information. Then, in February 2003, some 26 years after the disappearance of Flight 232, news broke that 2 mountaineers, Pablo Chiquiza and Flavio Armas, had encountered wreckage high on the flank of Ecuador's highest mountain, the huge stratovolcano named Mount Chimborazo. Would this discovery finally solve the mystery of what happened to Flight 232? Chiquiza and Armas, both members of the Nuevos Horizontes Mountaineering Club, had apparently heard from a fellow climber, Miguel Cazar, about the existence of metal wreckage and human remains high on one of the eastern glaciers of the 20,500-foot Mount Chimborazo. This was a difficult-to-reach and rarely visited area of the mountain. Chiquiza and Armas managed to climb to the remote site, spending a day and night sifting through the wreckage before returning on the third day. Among the debris, they reportedly found tins of food, newspapers from 1976 which were still legible, scattered luggage, and frozen bodies, some still strapped into their seats and almost perfectly preserved in the frozen atmosphere. On their descent from the mountain, they spoke to a local villager about finding the crashed plane, and he, somewhat surprisingly, said, "Oh, the military went up there years ago, but they never found anyone alive." This strange statement made it clear to them that the plane had apparently already been discovered years ago, but the finding was never reported. It spurred them on to start their own investigation. At this point in the story, things get a bit muddled. Instead of the news breaking that, in all likelihood, Flight 232 had in fact been found, there seems to have been a kind of a news blackout put in place instead. Galo Arrieta, a retired military officer, had contacted the two climbers to help them break the news of the find, insisting though that he be the one to decide when the news went public, as, for some reason seemingly known only to him, it was imperative that the Ecuadorian president, Lucio Guterres, needed to be the first one to hear about the wreck. So in December of 2003, the two climbers, Chiquiza and Armas, once again made the tortuous climb back up to the wreckage. Their mission this time was to recover as many ID papers as possible and to prove once and for all that Flight 232 had been found. At this point, it seems that most Ecuadorians knew that a plane and multiple bodies had been found high on the mountain, but no official confirmation had been made. Having successfully recovered at least one intact ID, the climbers returned back down, handing over the evidence to Arrieta so that he could break the news. But for some reason, Arrieta seems to have been most reluctant to break the news to anyone, and instead he just kept quiet about the whole affair. Eventually, after months of inaction, the two mountaineers managed to speak to the Ecuadorian Minister of Defense, who immediately ordered a full military expedition to the site, and the news that Flight 232 had finally been found was officially released. The long wait for the surviving relatives was over. It had taken 26 years for someone to finally say it, but their loved ones had been found. The reason for Arrieta's strange refusal to disclose the news of finding the wreck has never really been solved. He's sort of just stuck to his story that it was the president that had to be the first to know, and that was that. Although I did read one eyewitness report which stated that all the bodies high on the mountain had all been robbed. The quote said, "Upon finding the wrecked plane and preserved bodies of the passengers, it was evident that others had been there before. The passengers had been stripped of their jewellery and wallets. By whom and when? That will probably remain unknown." But I want to stress that that quote was only attributed to an anonymous source, so that might not be true. In the end, due to the inaccessibility of the site and the difficulty of the climb, it was decided to leave the site untouched, declaring it a sacred site off-limits to climbers and tourists. And so, to this day, the wreckage of Flight 232 and the remains of its 59 occupants are still there, high on the eastern flank of Ecuador's highest mountain, in their frozen tomb.